In protecting his citizens from Segismundo, Basilio engages in what Pierre Bordeaux would call symbolic violence. John B. Thompson succinctly summarizes Bordeaux's theories on symbolic violence when he states that in the routine flow of day-to-day life, power is seldom exercised as overt physical force. Instead, it is transmuted into a symbolic form and thereby endowed with a kind of legitimacy that it would not otherwise have. This legitimacy is often based in what Bordeaux classifies as the paradox of the monopolization of collective truth, or the violence that is part and parcel of the oracle effect. Bordeaux writes, I am the incarnation of the collective, and by virtue of that fact, I am the one who manipulates the group in the very name of the group. And this violence makes its presence felt in the quasi-physical impossibility of producing a divergent, dissident speech against the enforced unanimity, which is produced by the monopoly of speech and the techniques for creating unanimity. Basilio is an expert. He is a doctor. He witnessed Segismundo's birth, and he uses this knowledge and his position of power to justify his son's incarceration. Not surprisingly, and as a logical extension of forced unanimity, Basilio systematically controls Segismundo's education and the public's knowledge of what happened to his son. Basilio's aim is to legitimize his actions, and any information that might disclaim his conclusions is disregarded as irrelevant when compared to the collective goal of protecting the people. Basilio limits his son's experience and carefully monitors the amount and content of the information that he receives through the Catholic. His education is no less than what Bordeaux characterizes as the exercise of arbitrary power under the guise of legitimate order. As such, the educator imposes meaning as legitimate by concealing the power relations that he bases on its force. Basilio hides behind Cataldo, and Segismundo does not even know his father exists. In fact, Clarín and Rosaura are taken as prisoners because they have gained access to Segismundo's tower, and Basilio's secret is at risk of being discovered. Clotaldo tells the soldiers to cover their faces so that they will not be recognized. Todos os cubrir los rostros, que es diligencia importante mientras estamos aquí. Que nadie nos conozca nadie. The sense of unanimity that Basilio has carefully crafted in his kingdom is threatened, and the king realizes that he must conduct a scientific experiment to prove that Segismundo's incarceration is justified. However, Basilio misconstrues human experience as a puzzle to be resolved, as an enigma of sorts, without recognizing his son's humanity. Bringing us back to O'Connor's notion that Calderon subverts traditional Spanish values by testing their ability to respond to and to validate individual human experience. In realizing his prueba, or su experimento, Basilio attempts to recognize his son's humanity momentarily, but ultimately his efforts are only met with a violent response by Segismundo, which only makes sense to the audience. When Segismundo arrives at the palace, he behaves badly, as you all know, throwing the servant out the window and threatening the other individuals. Then he encounters with a similar fate. However, his behavior does not seem that unreasonable, given the way that he has been treated by his father, and at this point it becomes clear that epistemic violence often engenders physical violence. In other words, Basilio's interpretation of his son's birth, the enigma, or puzzle that he tries to decipher earlier in the play, and his attempt to reconcile the violent clash between life and death that he witnesses during this tragic event, are the cause of Segismundo's violent behavior. After Basilio carries out his faulty experiment, and Segismundo is transported back to his tower, it is not long before the people arrive to free their prince. Once Segismundo takes control of the situation and becomes the new king, he incarcerates the rebel soldier, whose rebellion led to his freedom from the ascent of the throne. Superficially, Segismundo's actions are not that much different from his father's, and it is clear that without the intervention of the rebel soldier, Poland would still be without its legitimate ruler. Bordeaux's theories stress how symbolic systems exercise power and how the dominated accept and perpetuate their own conditions of domination when he writes that power is executed only through the complicity of those who do not want to know that they are subject to it or even that they themselves exercise it. Segismundo is now in the position to exercise power, and in doing so, he must, like Basilio, eradicate elements that threaten his status as Poland's new king. Throughout the text, Segismundo has been presented as an enigma, as a visual sign that does not quite make sense. However, when Segismundo incarcerates the individual who is responsible for his freedom, the visual image of the rebel soldier in the tower does not superficially constitute a visual enigma, but rather the exercise of legitimate power by part of the new king. It only seems logical that a potential threat to the throne be contained and properly castigated. Order is restored, Rosaura marries Astolfo, and the threat of violence, hybrid beings and rebel soldiers, is contained. However, as Segismundo systematically legitimizes and conceals the basis of his own power, moving from margin to center, much like Spivak's subaltern, both Segismundo and the rebel soldier accept and perpetuate the conditions that place both of them in the catachresis space of the tower, representing political power in a disguised form and perpetuating the violence inherent to binary oppositions, supposedly inherent oppositions. Segismundo occupies the position previously held by his father, and the rebel soldier finds himself in the tower. The issue of the rebel soldier continues to be an issue of critical debate, not only because it calls into question Segismundo's ability to be a good king, by establishing an undeniable parallel between the prince and his father. And in the last comment of Segismundo, he also questions that ability to some extent. But also because his presence reminds us of the fine and somewhat precarious line between the palace and the tower, la vida es sueño, between normalization and catachresis, and most importantly, between life and death. In short, Calderon does not completely rid his play of the enigma and the epistemological and symbolic possibilities of the catachrestic space, occupied sequentially by Rosaura, Segismundo, and the rebel soldier. By rendering the accepted outcome of the play, a rebel in jail, enigmatic through a series of symbolic displacements, Rosaura, Segismundo, and Soldado, Calderon explores the concept of epistemic violence by revealing the basis of Segismundo's power. The fact that critics will probably never completely agree on the significance of the soldier's fate suggests that it is impossible to resolve the enigma of the many forms of violence and inhumanity that are part of our shared human experience.